Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fensky. Happy Friday to you. Today, APM Reports is releasing an hour-long radio documentary about race at the University of Missouri. In the coming months, this documentary will be broadcast on radio stations across the country, and that includes this Saturday at 3 p.m. here on St. Louis Public Radio. The documentary looks at Mizzou 5 years after the Concerned Student 1950 movement highlighted decades of racism at Mizzou, toppled a university president, and kicked off a national movement on college campuses. But the documentary does even more than that, as St. Louis Public Radio producer Lauren Brown explains at the beginning of the documentary.
When I graduated from Mizzou in 2019, I got a job at St. Louis Public Radio. A couple of months later, I got a call from some producers at APM Reports. They asked me if I wanted to help them with a story about what happened in the fall of 2015 at Mizzou. You might have heard about that. It was all over the news for a few months.
The university has been the center of national attention over racial tensions on campus.
There were protests, a hunger strike, the football team threatened not to play. Eventually, some top administrators resigned, and similar protests started on campuses across the country.
Activist students are following suit from Yale to Ithaca College.
Dozens of University of Michigan students took to the streets this morning to protest racism at the school.
I agreed to help these producers do a documentary looking back at that year, but I didn't want to do just another story about protests at Mizzou. The stories I've seen in the news make it seem like a couple of bad things happened out of nowhere. Then there were protests and things went back to normal. But that's not what I saw. I saw students put their grades on the line, their jobs, their reputations, so they could tell people what was really going on at their school. And that's what I want to tell you about, what it's like to be a black student on a predominantly white campus, because this is the same reality black students face all over the country. I want to tell you what we went through and how we took care of each other and how we built a community for ourselves that we call Black Mizzou.
And the documentary is called Black at Mizzou, Confronting Race on Campus. And joining me actually in studio today to talk about it is Lauren Brown. She's a host and producer with the We Live Here podcast, which is produced by St. Louis Public Radio and PRX. And she is also the narrator of this awesome new documentary, Black at Mizzou. So Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So as you explain in the documentary, you didn't want to just tell a story about the Concerned Student 1950 movement. Why is that?
Because I felt like that story was being told over and over again, and it kind of seemed like, oh, it was just a couple of protests. These black students were just mad, and I wanted to show the type of community that we built with each other. It was my freshman year. I didn't have that many friends at first, and so I was able to meet people, and we built a community. We built Black Mizzou, and that's a community within a school. It's a school within a school, and a lot of people that go to Mizzou, they know what Black Mizzou is. If you say Black Mizzou, they know exactly what it is, and you know exactly where to find those students. We have a black hole. It's in the student center, so you know where we are. And another professor that we interviewed, which didn't make the documentary, she said that Black Mizzou is something unlike any other place. All the other schools that she's worked at, she's never seen anything like it. And so I wanted to tell that story, the story of those people that inspired me to be the person that I am today. And that's the story I wanted to tell.
And you do end up telling that story. It's a great story. I learned so much from this. But I imagine you're coming in as the youngest person working on this. Was it hard to persuade these seasoned radio producers at APM Reports that this was the way to go?
Actually, it wasn't. I started to tell them my story, and they were eager to learn more. They were excited. They helped me bring my ideas to life, and they understood that this is a story I wanted to tell, and if I was going to be a part of it, that is something that needed to be told. And so they were great. They offered so many things for me. I learned so much from them, and it was a great situation.
So in this documentary, you really open up about your personal story. You came to Mizzou after growing up in Chicago. Why the University of Missouri? It seems like a completely different world than the one you were used to.
Yes. Well, actually, Mizzou was my top choice. Well, it was my only choice, actually, because I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, whether it was writing or radio. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And they have the Missouri School of Journalism. So I said, hey, I'll go to Mizzou. I had cousins that went there already. And so it was an easy transition for me, and I was really excited, but reality hit.
Yeah, it's a great journalism school, but as you talk about in this documentary, it was a huge culture shock. What was the hardest part for you of being at this place in this small town in Missouri?
I think the hardest part for me was not seeing people that look like me on a regular basis. Like if I wanted to see Black students, it had to be at certain events, or I had to, reach out and go to those things. But just walking around campus on a normal day or going to class, you're the only Black student there. And so that was hard for me to learn in a different environment and have professors that didn't look like me and that didn't understand how I needed to be taught. So that was a really big culture shock for sure.
And you mentioned the professors. That's something I want to talk about here. In the documentary, you talk to other Black students about their experiences at Mizzou, and just a lot of disturbing stories. The student body president talked about having the N-word shouted at him. But I think equally disturbing, even though it's a lot more subtle, is an encounter with a professor. And this was recounted in the documentary by a student named Andrea Fulgham.
There's an English class you have to take.
Here's Andrea again.
And I got pulled into one of the meetings with my professor. And she was asking me weird questions about scholarships. So what scholarships did you get and all of this other stuff. So I kind of walked her through in high school, it's 4.2 GPA. I was involved in sports. I was top 10 of my class.
Andrea told the professor that during high school, she didn't think she was going to college. When Andrea did decide to go to college, it was too late for most scholarships.
But I did get the Diversity and Inclusion Award. And so that's the scholarship that they give marginalized students. And I was blessed to have that because it did help with the payments. And she goes into this conversation of well, do you think it's fair that you all get this scholarship? And I was like, you all, what do you mean? And she's like, do you think it's fair because there are white students who don't get a scholarship because they're white? And I was just like, okay, why are we having this conversation? We're supposed to be reviewing my paper. And she went on this tangent about how almost I did not deserve to be at Mizzou. And the only reason I was there was because of this scholarship. And for me, that was obnoxious, I guess, and I was very agitated because I knew my work ethic, I knew my intelligence, and that conversation was very belittling to me. And I had to then explain to this professor, a grown woman, and I was just 18 at the time, do you understand that these systems were never built for people that look like me? And do you understand that student still has more chances of success than me, statistically? And so she started going into affirmative action and how I was a part of a number. And that's the only reason why I was there. And that was one of the worst experiences. I remember calling my mom and just am I supposed to be at Mizzou?
And that's Andrea Fulgham. She's speaking in the new radio documentary, Black at Mizzou, that airs 3 p.m. on this station this Saturday. And Andrea was one of the original 11 members of the Concerned Student 1950 activist group that brought some big changes to Mizzou. And we're talking today to Lauren Brown, who's the narrator of this new documentary. Lauren, you also opened up in the documentary about a very personal incident, and this was something that happened in your dorm and was very scary for you at the time. Was this something that was hard to talk about with the radio producers?
Yes, definitely. It was something that I tried to just, forget about and not bring up again. And so at first, I just retold the story. And then as we talked to more people, and I specifically talked to someone that helped me out during that time, I kind of struggled with talking about that event because it was I was the only Black person working on a documentary, and I felt like I had to carry the weight of dealing with emotional and mental trauma every day, interviewing different folks about, what it's like to be Black at Mizzou and what it's like to be Black in this country. And it was really hard for me. And at times I just had to take a moment, take a breath, but I just knew that it was something important and I just had to tell the story.
And so when this happened, you were studying journalism. You knew you wanted to be a journalist. Did you think at the time, this is something that someday I'm going to tell this story?
No, I didn't think that at all. Actually, just like Andrea, advisor, actually, she told me to switch to the comm school, go to the communication school. She said a lot of you all don't really make it into the journalism school. Maybe you should change your major. And I remember calling my mom and just being so discouraged, like, am I going to be able to do this? And I just made it a point that day that was my mission, to graduate from the journalism school. And I completed that mission. And I was on the dean list multiple times. And so I just had to prove myself over and over and over again, because it's always like, oh, you all don't really make it that far. You all really need help. And it was really hard to go through things like that. And so I didn't know that I would be doing this story now, but I just know that now that was preparing me for the future.
Hearing Andrea's clip where she's talking about how that affected her to hear that from a professor, she questioned whether this was a place that she belonged. Did you find yourself thinking, man, what am I doing at this school? I should transfer.
I thought about it, but I was like, I can't transfer. I want to be a journalist. This is one of the best journalism schools. Like, I made friends. I built a community. It was hard at times, but it was also something that I needed to learn. And I remember my dad telling me that this is the real world now. You are in the real world, and you're going to have to deal with things like this. And if you want to be a journalist, you have to have thick skin, and you have to be able to deal with things like this. And so I just made it a point to make sure that in moments of weakness that I thought about what my purpose was, and that I made sure that I went out and completed that purpose.
So you were there. Not only were you dealing with all the stuff that people talk about in this documentary of the professors saying things like this and other students doing things, this was also a time of great change on top of all that. You personally weren't part of that Concerned Student 1950 group, but how closely were you watching as that situation unfolded in your freshman year?
Oh, I was watching everything. During that time, it was a lot of tweets going out. They had town halls that I went to, protests that I went to. And so a lot of people don't have the courage to be on the front lines. And that's how I felt at that time, being a freshman and being so young. I didn't think that I had the strength to be on the front lines, but I knew that I wanted to stand up for what I believed in. And so I was always around and witnessing what was going on and just taking it all in and learning more about myself and learning more about my strength as a Black woman and what I needed to do in the future. So I think that me seeing those things and not necessarily being involved, but seeing it, it helped me grow into who I am today.
So by the time you were a senior, a couple years passed since everything that happened that freshman year, do you think changes came to Mizzou, that some of these things, these experiences that people had, would these things still happen there today?
These things will definitely still happen there today. Over the summer, we've seen the hashtag Black at Mizzou on Twitter. We've seen the Mizzou athletics get in trouble for tweets. So those things still happen today. It hasn't went anywhere. They've been trying to, make changes and add different things like a bias hotline and things of that nature. But I've went through the cycle of trying to get help when I experienced some harassment, and that didn't help me. So I'm not sure what they plan to do, but something definitely needs to change.
It seems like one of the really unfortunate things that came out of this is that not only did enrollment drop at the University of Missouri as a whole, but the number of Black students actually dropped. I imagine that probably makes things even harder for that freshman who's starting there, who's in the shoes that you were in 5 years ago.
Yes, and you have to search for Black events or the Black Culture Center. When you go there for a tour, they don't necessarily show you the Black Culture Center. And so that's something that you have to search for to find a belonging. And that's kind of hard for somebody to do. That's 18. They're coming from a different state. It's kind of hard to do that. So I will hope that they can kind of boost that enrollment back up, because a lot of Black students were going to Mizzou before I got there. A couple of years before that, I said my cousins attended. So I just hope that they can be able to boost that enrollment back up.
So Black Mizzou was so important for you when you were there as a student, and now you're talking about that experience in this documentary. What does that phrase, Black Mizzou, what does that mean to you today?
Black Mizzou, it means family, it means support, it means standing up for what you believe in, it means owning who you are and owning your Blackness, and it means not being afraid to say that, yes, I'm Black, but also I attend this university too, and this is my school as well. Black Mizzou is me, and I'm Black Mizzou, and that's exactly what it means to me.
Well, it's great to hear about how this experience, while this was such a hard experience for you, it sounds like this is the experience that kind of got you to where you are today. And I know now you're a producer on We Live Here, also a host that delves into race and equity in St. Louis. Do you see similarities between what you experienced at Mizzou and what you cover now as a journalist in St. Louis?
Yes. If you go go back to the introductory episode to season 5 for We Live Here, I talked about coming to Missouri, the state as a whole, and just feeling like it was such a thickness in the air that I could almost smell it, that it was so different from where I came from. Not to say that those things didn't happen there as well, but it was a little more hidden. And so here it was kind of a little more overt. And I had to learn how to deal with talking about being Black every day. And that was kind of a struggle. Like I said before, being the only Black person working on these projects, it's a gift and a curse in a way, because it's a gift because I want to shine light on these stories. I want to be a part of these movements, but also it's a curse because it's so much. It's a weight. It's a really heavy weight, but it's a weight that I feel like it is my duty and it is my purpose to do that, and I feel like that's what I'm here for.
Well, Lauren Brown, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for shining a light on everything you've witnessed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And Lauren, again, she's a host and producer on the We Live Here podcast, and Black at Mizzou, Confronting Race on Campus, the new radio documentary that she narrates, that airs on this station. That is this Saturday at 3 p.m. There's also a rebroadcast next Tuesday, August 18th at 8 p.m. And you can download the podcast as of today. It's there on APM Reports website. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.